and get situated for a second, and then we're going to get started.
Awesome. Welcome, everybody. A little prompt here in chat. Feel free to chime in and chat throughout the webinar if you want, and let people know where you're calling from, what role or company or firm you're with, and anything specific you're especially curious about today that we can bubble up to our awesome panel. Otherwise, we'll give it maybe 30 seconds here and then jump on in.
Perfect. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm J.Thelander, founder and CEO of J.Thelander Consulting, and very excited today as we are going to monitor the chat. We've got a little team behind us, so we'd like this to be as interactive as possible. We've got great expertise and resources and data for you, which we can show you all of or parts of, if whatever is really your priority. So please keep your questions coming, and anything that's unique to your business or what you have going on. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Matt, who is the co-founder and CEO of Bolster. So passionate about boards that he's even written a book on it. So Matt, I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, hi everyone. I see a couple friendly names and faces here as well. So welcome and thank you for joining us. As Jody said, I'm co-founder and CEO of a company called Bolster. Bolster is a next generation executive search firm. We do a combination of things that sort of make us different from every other traditional search firm. One is that we're also a software platform that uses kind of state-of-the-art AI and data science to drive more effectiveness and efficiency in searches. But the other thing we do that's different is we don't just do full-time executive hire searches. We also do a tremendous number of board searches. We have a leadership consulting group that does advisory work for CEOs around their executive teams and boards and kind of effective leadership of those things. As Jody said, I'm co-author of a few books, one called Startup CEO, one called Startup CXO, and then the most relevant one here is called Startup Boards, which I co-authored with a couple of VCs, Brad Feld and Mahendra Ramsingani. And I personally have sat on over a dozen boards, public, private, nonprofit, civic, et cetera. And this is a topic I spent a lot of time on, a lot of time advising and coaching CEOs on how to build and lead effective boards. So happy to be here for the conversation. Jenny.
Great. And yeah, go ahead, introduce Jenny.
Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here. I'm Jenny Fielding. I run a fund called Everywhere Ventures, where we believe innovation's everywhere, and we want to be where the best founders are. So what that means is we invest globally, which is pretty unique. We're a pre-seed fund, and I'm based in New York City. And hopefully I can bring the perspective of someone who's been a founder. I've been a two-time founder, so I've had board members. And now I've been investing actually for the last decade, so I've sat on boards. I've seen functional and dysfunctional. So I'm kind of an open book of giving feedback. So please, ask the hard questions. And hopefully with this great trifecta, we can, give you some practical use points and touch points of where to go from there. So thanks for having me.
Perfect. Yeah, Jenny, you've been in a very unique position, a founder, operator, and investor, and board member. So that's great. Well, I'm going to jump into a little bit. I'm going to share my screen right now. And hopefully this is going to be easy for everybody to see. And we'll go on and off screen as well so that we can address questions too. So basically, behind the scenes, just so you know, the data for today is all from our real-time J.Thelander platform. So we survey the firms directly, the companies directly. Everyone who participates there's no charge to participate, and everyone gets access to a subset of the results for a year for no charge. So a lot of people find that to be the main compelling reason. And then you can also have access to all the other surveys. So we cover everything on private company compensation across, I think what Jenny said was so interesting. So our data is global, and also we cover all industries on tech, life sciences, which includes biotech, medical device, all the convergence, which is very much relevant today. And then we get very granular into topics like what we're looking at today on outside board member compensation. So this data is real time. We pulled it this week to include for today. And then in addition to that, we do not only for events like today, grab the data and put analysis with it, because that's very important, right? The data is only as good as you know what to do with it. And there's a lot of information on salaries and venture debt and gender and different stages of companies, Europe versus USA. So we include those in our digest, which we send out every month. And the area for non-investor board member compensation, which maybe we want to clarify what that is, and Matt, feel free to jump in. So our definition of it is a board member who has not contributed capital, someone who comes from the outside, who is adding some kind of high-level expertise or skill set. I don't know, Matt and Jenny, do you have the same definition or?
Pretty much. I mean, my definition is really simple. There are three kinds of board members: investors, management, and independents. So I think it's the same.
Yep, maps.
Yeah. So we're looking at the comp for an independent person. So they are, and we look at the different levers that they could be compensated, and that could be annual cash. It could be annual cash only, annual equity only, one-time equity only, meaning they get you get an initial grant and you don't get any more, and then a mixture of annual cash and annual equity, annual cash and one-time equity, and then annual equity and one-time equity, meaning you get equity up front and then you get additional grants. So I think the part here to remember, to see really, is that there's quite a bit of landscape and terrain. Jenny, from your experience of having been on a board, I think tech companies tend to really focus more on equity. What would you say is going on in the market?
Yeah, one-time equity, I would say, is everything that I've been involved in. Mostly, again, if I'm coming on a board, it's at that seed and Series A, and so there just isn't a lot of cash to go around, right? So the cash really needs to go into the business, and there's a lot of upside, potentially if the board members really kind of help the startup along. There's a lot of upside there. So I'd say, I've only really seen equity in the boards that I've been involved in.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. The private venture-backed boards, and certainly pre-venture, early stage boards are almost entirely equity. Public is almost entirely cash and equity, although frequently that equity looks like RSUs that turn into cash pretty quickly. And private equity boards, late stage private equity boards, sometimes have a mix of cash and equity in our experience, but the venture-backed set is really just an equity grant.
Oops. Uh-oh, here's my daughter's wedding. Hang on, I shared the wrong screen. Hang on, new share.
It's a great photo, though.
I know. Listen, of all the photos to show, me walking my daughter down the, for such a badass at work, I'm such a mush at home with my kids. So I guess that's the little best kept secret. Okay, so here are the levers, which I think is very much in line with what you were just saying here, is because we showed this by the different stages of financing, and that's exactly right, is that you can see, we don't really get into, Matt, you had touched upon sort of the pre-seed. We don't really get into that because in order to participate in a J.Thelander survey, you have had to raise some kind of capital, and there has to be some formality and structure. Like if we get someone who participates who says they own 100% of the equity, then obviously that number is going to cause friction inside of our data set. But this shows you less than $15 million of total financing raised. And so exactly what you both were saying is that tends to be the one-time equity only. And then you can see that it stays pretty consistent, although when you get into the later stage, and now we've even added into our data, used to be 200 million plus, now we're up to 500 million plus, but we don't see a big difference between the 90 million plus. And you can see that things get a little more mixed in terms of the cash and equity and so on. And then that also is leveraged by industry, right? Because this is where we had a discussion a little bit yesterday. And Jenny, while you weren't able to join us, I'm sure you know this, that, tech tends to be pure equity driven versus the biotech and device areas, the life sciences tends to be more of a mix on cash and equity, really because you have a lot of MDs and PhDs who are used to either being in the hospitals or in labs, and they're used to getting paid for their time. So what's your experience been on this?
We're a tech, so it goes, it's right in line. I don't have a lot of experience with medical devices, unfortunately, or biotech, but I can understand, why those numbers are, especially on the medical devices side, just with the cost.
Yeah. Yeah, Matt, fill us in a little bit. I mean, what I find so interesting is that you really hone in when you're curating boards and doing searches. What does that look like? What's the process? So you see all this information. Now we know, okay, how you're going to compensate, but what are you doing from the, more holistic side?
Well, there's sort of two sides to what we do. It's board building and then effective board leadership. On the board building side, and I can go deep on either one of them, but on the board building side, the first thing we have to do, quite honestly, is evangelize the importance of having independent directors, because a lot of founders, first-time CEOs, et cetera, don't really know what to make of a board and don't really want one or don't really like one, don't know what a great one looks like.
So they're sort of forced on them with the investors, right? So.
Oh yeah, right. And then they're afraid of losing control and, fine, I have to have a board, but why would I want a bigger board? So we spend a lot of time sort of in that space. And then once we get to a place where a CEO is interested in adding independent directors and really building out a high functioning board, then the question becomes, okay, well, who am I looking for? Or what's the spec? And the spec is really different now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. 10 or 20 years ago, it was find me a very experienced or retired CEO in my space. And it's a lot more nuanced than that now, partly because of the push for more diverse boards, but partly because I think people have come to appreciate the fact that different companies need different voices in the boardroom at different stages of their life. And sometimes, yes, it is that experienced CEO, helping a little bit mentor a first-time CEO along.
Yeah, or drive revenue, right? I mean, Jenny, you know that. Yeah.
I mean, there are plenty of times where what you really need is a product person, or what you really need is, an HR leader or a lawyer or a go-to-market person. It really depends. We encourage our clients to think about their board and their executive team as a team, like that's your kitchen cabinet. And what's the voice that's missing? Is it voice of customer, et cetera? So we spend a lot of time sort of helping bring the CEO along for the journey of, what she actually needs on her board. Then the question of how to lead a high impact board is a completely different one that I can also talk about at length, but I'm not sure that's what you were asking.
I mean, I can for 1 second, and just because something that you said, I'm not sure that everyone quite understands, and it's this, like, when do you need to start thinking about your board? And I think when I started my first company in 2007, as a seed company, everyone was fighting for board seats, right? It was like, that was kind of part of the culture. I think, 15 years later, there's been a lot of shift. And during the ZERP years, I think when founders had a little bit more control, of the financing rounds, of the structure, there was this idea that a board was not founder friendly. And that was kind of this narrative that was propagated. And so I think we need to rewind that a little bit. And I think to, what you're saying, Matt, if you have an effective board, right, with an industry expert as an independent or a diverse person, a board can be, incredibly strategic and this great tool for the CEO. And so I think what's happening is that we just have a lot of misinformation, because a good, highly functional board, even at the early stage, can be a huge unlock for the CEO. So I just wanted to mention that, because I feel like as the seed stage investor, I hear that from my founders all the time. The investor wants to take a board seat. What do you think?
Yeah, I was at a conference last week in Palo Alto for health tech. And there was a very successful CEO, from One Medical. And he was saying that how he uses his board is that he preps everybody ahead of time. He sends out the board materials. And Matt, I know you're shaking your head. Yes, because I know it has to be, right? You want to have it very organized, as well as send it out in time. So that by the time you get to the board meeting, all of the hard stuff has been out of the way and you're not really negotiating. We see this when we're doing comp work for private companies, right? That we are looking and putting together the comp for the CEO, could also be a founder, as well as the senior team, and that we want the deck to basically give them ranges of here's what we want, because we don't want the board to be making these decisions on the spot and then having to ask for more data. They want, you should be prepared. I do want to remind everybody that we want this to be interactive, and we do have people following the chat. So if you have any questions, please jump in. Matt, I am going to show one thing that you mentioned, because I just think it's great that we have this data. So we do survey, because we survey for every single job, gender and ethnicity. So here's the non-investor board ethnicity. So 85% white. And then we also have the executive chairman ethnicity. And I believe we have gender in here. Oh, we don't have gender. Okay, so we have ethnicity. We probably do have gender. I'm not sure if it's in this deck, but we do see that there is not as much diversity. It's changing a little bit, but, and then in addition to this, let's talk a little bit about the whole, let's see, I'm going to go back to some data. Hang on, I'm going to go back without giving us whiplash. So this is the information we talked about by industry. And then here is, okay, we got a couple of questions coming in too. Great. So these numbers talk about non-investor board equity. So the most common, exactly what you were saying, Jenny, is one-time equity. And by the way, if anyone takes a screenshot, we're happy that you're seeing this. Please just don't post it online someplace, because it is copyrighted. We've had some challenges with that in the past. Okay, so we've got the most common is the one-time equity, and here are the actual numbers. And funny enough, I just had a call from somebody yesterday, a colleague of mine who is on 3 boards and asked to go on another one. And she said they offered her 0.25%. Does that seem low? And Jenny, you just said something very important, and that is it depends on the stage of the company. So these levers are further looked at, right? Because if it's an early stage company, obviously, and they're raising capital, they don't have a lot of cash. So you would assume that they're going to go higher on equity. So fill us in on what, exactly how to use this information. 0.25%, 0.5%, 1%. We showed a maximum up to 3%.
Yeah, I mean, again, stage specific and company type specific, but I, usually advise my companies at the seed stage that, a 1/4 point for an independent is actually, quite generous in many ways. Obviously, if you have a company that's going to go public soon, a 1/4 point of that is going to be a lot more. So very stage specific, a little bit on category as well. And then I think something we haven't really talked about, but, is it vesting, and then over how long? So that's like another, I think, topic. I think, we used to see that board seats, people would have board seats for a decade, and now we're seeing,
here's your data, Jenny, right on cue. You can talk through this.
I love, and now you're seeing that, so now you're seeing 4 years. So that's interesting. And I remember when I started a company, people just expected to be on the board forever. But remember, if you can swap
this is 4-year vesting and then this is also, right, this is the vesting by industry, and you can see consistencies, and then is, and also by total financing, almost always, it could be a little shorter, but yes, so this is coming up the vesting schedule.
Got it. So yeah, 4-year vesting. And then you have a good opportunity of rotating that person out, which I think is also another tool that the CEO can use. You can get fresh blood on the in the boardroom, which I think is great. And also to Matt's point, that's also a great opportunity to bring in more diversity. Maybe you started with a less diverse board because you felt like you needed more experienced people at certain, with certain vertical experience. This is a great opportunity to layer in some diverse people if you can refresh that board. And I know, Matt, you have a lot of specific guidelines on how to do that.
I do, yeah. I have like 12 things I wanted to say here. So the first, let me start with length of vesting, which I sort of equate to term of service. And
interesting.
Yeah,
we need to add that into our survey. I'm going to ask that question. Like, does the vesting equate with length of service?
Yeah, I mean, so my view of vesting has changed over the years. When I was running my last company, which admittedly was a bigger company than my current company, 4 years was kind of my standard. And that's how people think of option grants, right? You have an employee, you give them a 4-year grant, and people did that with directors. The advice that we give to early stage clients now, so I think late stage clients, a 4-year vest is good. When I'm talking to a really early stage CEO, who's even through like a full Series A, sometimes even Series B, I recommend a 2 or a 3-year vest, and fewer options. So I think of the option grant as basis points per year.
That's a
And
really important point, and you can maybe, explain that a little
yeah,
bit.
no,
Because it has to be a lesser amount if it's
it
going
has
to
to be a lesser amount for sure, but I think of it as basis points per year. And the reason for early stage companies that I recommend a 2 or a 3-year vest is the company doesn't know what it's going to need in 2 or 3 years. And it gives you an easy off ramp if the board member is not what you need in 2 years for the next 2 years.
I mean, you won't have to get into, do we give them, are they able to get full vesting? And we've been asked that question. I'm going to hold off because we've had a lot of questions coming in from the audience. So I'm going to get into a couple of these because it's relevant to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But we had a question saying that 0.5% seemed like it was a steep, right?
Right.
For an independent who isn't a chair or an executive chair. I would argue that's not steep at all, but I think.
So let me address that piece a little bit as well. Which, the research that Bolster has done on independent board comp, and again, our client base skews very much venture-backed tech. It is not nearly as diverse in size or in sector as your data, Jody. But that the grant definitely gets smaller in terms of basis points as the company gets bigger. I'm generally with Jenny that, sort of a 1/4 point-ish is good for the early stages. When you get to the later stages of private companies, we're seeing like 5 basis points per year. So a 4-year grant would be less than a 1/4 point, and it could even be smaller than that. But for whatever it's worth, because the data on early stage companies is so scant, the rule of thumb that I've heard a lot of VCs use, and I've seen data that sort of triangulates on this a little bit, is at whatever moment you're hiring a board member, think about how much equity you would give a new executive and cut it in half. And that's about the right grant for the board member. But then if you're doing a 2-year vest instead of a 4-year vest, you cut it in half again. So
and I think that's how I got to my, 0.25%, which is really, the function of 2 things. One is the stage, and then also that these folks, as you mentioned, probably are not going to add value for 10 years. If you're an early stage company, there's going to be something very strategic that they can help you with short term. They may not be the long-term person. So have them vest, have it be less. And if they're doing incredible, you can do a refresh, right?
Right. So that's exactly right. That's why we see the numbers, and I'm looking at my slides right now. We see these numbers saying that you can also have the one-time equity and annual equity, which is great because maybe you give them a little equity to come on, but then you can also adjust the equity as they keep going. So we had a question saying that you are using 1/4% per year that vests over 2 years. No, we're saying 1/4%. Let's say you bring in the outside board member and you have the 4-year vesting. That's 1/4% is over the 4-year vesting. And what Matt is saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you equate the vesting time with the term time, so that as somebody's fully vested, then you would potentially see that either their term is up or that you give them additional equity next time.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then the
whole process more like, as you said, I mean, the comp that I've heard is hiring like a VP, right? So what would you give the VP? And kind of with a similar mandate of, that person can be refreshed after they've had their 4-year vest.
Yeah, here's some data which might be helpful too, because I do think there are some nuances, and maybe I'm assuming that the person who asked that question saying 1/4% seemed that it was high. You can see from tech, and this is across dilute non-investor as a one-time fee for joining the board. So the 25th percentile is 0.1, the median is 0.2, and the 75th percentile is 0.85. And again, this adjusts depending on what stage of company this is and how much. I don't go as much by series of financing. And Matt, I know you say like Series A, Series B.
It's a proxy for.
Yeah, I think in today's market, like when we look at the comp data and all this, we like to get very specific because we've had so much gyrations around lately with somebody's Series A is $50 million and somebody's Series B is, so I think the series is great. There are some generalities, but really to look at this in full effect is better to know where you are in your total financing. And I know the conversation today is not so much segueing into this, but let's face it, is that if you get your option pool right to begin with, and you have allocated the right percentages to the founders, and then to have option pool, and then you have to the outside board members, when it comes to giving more equity, it's much easier if you've gotten it right to start with, because you're not up, against a wall where you're trying to recover because you gave too much to somebody. So these are very important decisions to make. And Jenny, you give us from the investor angle, right? If you're giving equity to somebody, it's coming from somebody else. It's coming from somewhere.
Yeah, so you need to protect your equity, right? And so you'll have an option pool for your employees, and then you have this kind of pool that you need to figure out somewhat beforehand of how much you're going to potentially allocate to this, advisor group and to your board. So you have to be very planful, and we encourage our founders to kind of think ahead. Okay, when you have a board, where is that going to come from, and ultimately kind of mostly come out of your shares.
I mean, Matt, that's sort of your angle on all this when you're doing your holistic recruiting and everything else. I mean, share with us you're very strategic, because you're really at the ground level of trying to get this right and help the teams, as you said, holistically and strategically plan for this. The earlier stage, the better, because you have a really good chance of running out on the horizon to make sure that you're thinking about all this.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, getting equity right in a startup is way more art than science, and way more prone to be wrong than anything else, because you just never know what your next financing is going to look like and the next financing is going to look like. So, I think, if you're talking about, is it a quarter of a point or is it, 0.2%? At the end of the day, it's not really going to, that part's not really going to matter. It's about getting someone that can be a high impact board member, and then about leading the board in such a way that you get the most out of your board.
Yeah, here is the information we talked about on the financing levels, right? So you can see this jives consistently with the smaller, less than 15 million, and the median tends to be higher. And obviously this is going down in terms of the one-time fee for joining the board. So you can see that these percentage ability are generally running around, this is where there's confusion, right? This is the tough time, the 15 to 15 million. And then of course it gets more normalized as you move into the higher amounts of financing. So I think,
and
Matt,
Jody, I would say sometimes it has to do with where your board members are from or where your company is from. So we have seen, if you're not in San Francisco or New York, that the numbers that we see are actually higher that the board members are taking. So it'd be interesting to see if there's any data on that, but that's just something we've noticed, in the same way that you notice, if you raise outside of the coast, oftentimes your valuations are lower. And so there are these kind of norms I find that also translate to how boards operate and the equity.
I mean, Matt, what are you seeing with geography? I mean, for us, we see that it's pretty agnostic. And I think, Jenny, your point is extremely well taken, in that there is no one way, that there is not like San Francisco's higher, New York's higher. I mean, it really depends on who the individual is. Top people are still getting paid at top levels. I know, Matt, you see that in all areas of your recruiting and your staffing.
And someone has just chimed in about Europe. They see between 0.5%, so 1.5, and in MENA region 1. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Look, I think one of the gifts that COVID left behind is that the geographic distinction is starting to melt a little bit, because now there are companies that are kind of everywhere and kind of nowhere, and I think over time that will be less and less of a distinction. But yes, valuations are still higher in New York and the Bay Area for sure. And competition for talented board members is going to be higher in those areas, and equity grants is going to be a little higher in those areas. But I think that the delta, and I could be wrong, Jenny, you see as many companies as I do, probably more, across all the components of the fund. But I think the equity distinction for directors by geography is way less than the equity distinction for executives across geographies. Like a CTO in the Bay Area for a consumer business and a CTO in Boise is going to be a very, very different thing. A great tech board member or a great experienced CEO board member in those two places might be a little different, but not a ton different.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, a lot of this also comes down to like what lawyers you're using, right? So if you're kind of using like the Cooleys, the Fenwicks, and whoever, they a lot of times have standardized some of this, which is interesting. But I've seen it, all different. Maybe because I also invest internationally, and people are chiming in that they're seeing other numbers there.
I mean, we have had a big push into Europe right now. We are doing an initiative with the UK because they're very interested in what's happening to be able to compare and contrast themselves, which is nice about our platform, the J.Thelander platform, for all aspects of this, is that it's global data and that you can filter and look at the US versus, you can look at parts of the US versus the whole of the United States against Europe and the UK separately, as well as other areas. And I think what we see across all these jobs, including outside board member compensation, is that it really depends on the market for that talent, who the competition is. We did have a question come in saying the companies in the emerging markets seek independents who take much more active roles in contribution versus, USA firms, and how would the equity share differ, right? And it really just depends on where that company is based and what the competition is. This is where, though, also, Matt, I would say you were talking about, the Bay Area versus New York. But then, Jenny, you also mentioned things like that's not on the coast in the Midwest, right? And it really, like what I hear is that given it really depends on what the company is recruiting for, where the talent market is, and who the competition is in that area, because some of these academic environments in like Michigan or Wisconsin, other areas have created a tall demand for talent, and they're getting paid more. Some of our highest data points are coming from those Midwest places.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Now, we do, including Wilson, by the way, I want to make sure Wilson gets in there because we work with them as well, and they give us content for questions. So here is some more data to talk about it, just to, pique your interest, is do outside board members, this goes further to, depending on how good your lawyers are, these are kinds of things also relevant inside of a company, or do outside members of the board have accelerated vesting in connection with the change of control? And you can see that it's a little heavier on the no, but almost at 50-50, right? And what is the,
yeah,
say,
I always recommend to CEOs that they give full vesting on change of control to board members. I feel like it's nearly a free give. Board members are going away in a sale. So I sort of encourage that. I also encourage a related item, which is an extended post-termination exercise period. So, frequently the company's standard option agreement for employees will say, like, you got 90 days to write a check after you leave.
Right, 3 months is standard.
And I never want to go to an ex-board member and say, hey, you got to write a check if you want to participate. Thanks for your help. So I tend to be very generous and recommend generosity on that front. The maximum PTEP is 10 years from the date of grant. Again, I feel like it doesn't really cost the company very much. You're not going to have.
But it does take out, Jenny, from you're an investor, how do you feel about that? Because it does take money off of the balance sheet that's no longer being used for the company, right? But it is equity that's standing. It's not as impactful. It's standing down.
Yeah, I do believe, though, that, you kind of go in good faith of, where the company's going. And so if that was the agreement, it is good to maintain that, assuming the person was kind of doing their job, to maintain what was agreed to. So I like the accelerated vesting upon change of control. I do think that, there are some impacts to the balance sheet, but you should think about those, to Matt's point, beforehand. So
here's the data on that. What is the acceleration, right? And this is 100% acceleration is the most common. And then I always love this question. Is it a single trigger or a double trigger? And by definition, the single trigger means that it just as a change of control is enough to trigger the acceleration. And then, Matt, to your point, though, is the double trigger change of control must be followed by a termination, but it's only must be. Most outside board members don't want to stay if they came into a private company. there's a lot more response. I mean, do you do public and private searches?
We do, yeah. I mean, single trigger. Can you go back to the data? Can you show that slide
Yeah,
again?
hang
See
on.
if it has
Absolutely.
single trigger on it, because single trigger of acceleration, if we fire you from the board, is not interesting to me at all.
Right. That's not on here.
Yeah,
This is
single-
assuming that you're,
right. So single
Yeah.
trigger, where you're saying the trigger is a change of control without a termination, is a little weird for a board member, because there's not really a circumstance where you sell the company but don't get rid of the board. I guess if you did a full recap of the company and changed financial owners without dissolving the board.
This wouldn't have to be financial orders. This could also just be a new CEO coming in, or somebody who really doesn't find you to be the right person for them.
Yeah, I would not advise someone to do single trigger.
Right.
But I think there are a lot of, I mean, that's like, you get into some real edge cases there.
Jenny, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd say these are the edge cases that we don't necessarily,
Have you negotiated this yourself when you've been a board member on single trigger, double trigger, or?
No.
Yeah, when I've been offered board seats, I ask for double trigger.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, these are more sophisticated, and they typically then have a ripple effect, right? Because then the CEOs and the other executives start to think to themselves, well, maybe I should have that. And early stage or founder CEOs, especially with tech companies, are probably not as apt to have change of control provisions or employment agreements. But when you hire other people, then you start to get into it, because it sort of triggers that in your mind that it's available. Matt, tell us, when you're doing an outside board member search, how does that go different from like an employee inside? Because some of the questions came up talking about, like, if someone's going to be actually taking on some responsibilities or guidance inside the company.
Yeah, I mean, if they're taking on responsibilities inside the company, they're not just a board member, then they're also acting as a consultant. And,
right.
The way I try to delineate that is consultants have deliverables, directors give advice. And if a CEO is trying to hire a board member and wants them, it's one thing to hire a board member and say, hey, I really want you to lean in and help me think about this, that, or the other thing. Or
right.
Back to my earlier point about, like, what kind of board member you're looking for. Like, hey, we're weakest in go-to-market. You're a go-to-market expert in our field. I'd love for you to spend some extra time with our sales team and our marketing team. That's fine. That's what board members do. If you're bringing on a board member and you're saying to them, like, hey, would you mind whipping up a 15-page marketing plan for us, because we don't have a marketing leader right now, then you're actually asking that person to be a consultant. You can have someone do both, but you should be really clear about which one is in which bucket and which form of compensation is in which bucket.
I think that gets muddled in founders' minds, because when they think that they're bringing on an independent, they feel like, okay, well, here's this person, I'm giving them equity, they should be, really working for me, which is different than attending a board meeting and giving some high-level advice. So I see sometimes that gets, confused in the translation.
Jenny, having done this from all sides, what would you say, would your advice to someone who's starting out, who you've been successful, obviously, in many angles, but having been a founder and built a company and have outside board members, what wisdom can you impart?
Yeah, so I like the shorter board service. I think there was a time where, or maybe a perception that if your board members rotate, that's a negative signal. And I don't think that should be at all. I'm kind of curious what Matt thinks of that. I think it's actually healthy to rotate people out. So that's, my first point. My second point is that, having a board shouldn't be a scary thing. And the best way to do that is to set expectations. So I don't take board seats at the pre-seed, but I spend a lot of time preparing my founders to run an effective board. And you touched on that, Jody, as well, sending the deck in advance. We like to send the deck in advance, or I encourage founders to send the deck in advance with an ability for the board members to write comments and questions and get that all out of the way before the board meeting. So then you come into this 2-hour meeting and all of that stuff has been clarified already. So you have to give at least a week's notice. And then the meeting is really about what's ahead. And I find the number one mistake is that they spend the whole time talking about the past, right? What didn't work, what worked. And like the board meeting has to be used strategically of like, where are we going and how can we as a board, help you get there? So I'd say that's like the second thing, is just be very clear and control your board and set that precedent when you start, because I find oftentimes by the Series B, the founders want to kind of reset the board and the expectations and the flow, and it's just very hard once you kind of have, the precedent set. So set it early. And I was on a very dysfunctional board where it was a late seed stage company, and there were five or six board members and like 2 observers or something. It's just too much. And actually the company was a great company, and they went on to have a really good exit. So they kind of muddled through, but also I would say, start small. And so sometimes I meet, pre-seed founders and they've already set up a board. So I like the initiative, but, at the same time, wait for the financing, kind of have these things mapped out, but don't necessarily give away board seats preemptively, because that can really bite you as well. So those are kind of my 3 takeaways of a decade.
Matt, what are your takeaways? What wisdom can you give everybody here? You're in the thick of it.
Give me something more specific.
Well, I mean, you've seen, I agree with Jenny in terms of the planning, and because we always do comp, decks for board meetings and comps.
Yeah.
And where we see very much so is when people need to be looking forward versus backward, right? And when you're doing a search for a board member, or actually that, for that matter, inside of a company, what are you seeing? What are the priorities at different stages? Like the early, I think also what Jenny said is very important, and it covers many areas, but I think getting your perspective, I mean, obviously you've written books on this, you're very thorough. The problem is if you make a mistake, it's very hard to unravel that. If you make a mistake in terms of the person, you make a mistake in terms of the cash equity mix, you make a mistake in terms of letting the inmates run the zoo, so the board's telling you what to do versus collaboration, or you being directive and having leadership. By the time you figure out these mistakes, it's very hard to undo it and then get onto a higher ground.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons to do shorter terms and shorter vesting in the early stages. It's also, I think it's really important to interview board members very thoroughly. And that's something that can be super daunting for a founder or first-time CEO, because they're generally interviewing people like way more senior than they are.
Right.
And they sort of feel like they don't have the right to put someone like that through a deep interview process. And the answer is they do.
Yeah.
They must. And, I think hiring a board member has a lot in common with hiring a senior executive. You'd never hire a senior executive without meeting with them multiple times. Without having to meet everybody else on the team, without doing a multi-hour interview yourself, or take them out to a meal, and try to get to know them a little bit as a human. And you should be doing the same thing with board candidates. I would also say, for a lot of companies, they won't hire a senior executive without having them do some form of what I call an audition. So if you're hiring a new head of sales, have them come in and pitch. Right? If you're hiring, if you're hiring an engineer, you probably have them come in and write code and watch them write code, or peer them with another engineer. And you should do the same thing with, with a board member. It's a little trickier. There's really only one way to audition a board member, which is have them come to a board meeting.
Yeah.
And that is part of our playbook. That when you get down to one finalist, you can't do it multiple times because you only have so many board meetings.
Right.
You invite them to a board meeting, not to observe. You invite them to a board meeting and you say to them, hey, before we put you on the board, we want you to come to a board meeting. This is an opportunity for both you and us to make a final determination that this is a good fit. Assuming it goes well, that will have been your first board meeting, and we'll make you the option grant. And if not, then we can talk about how to move forward from there.
Yeah. The fit is very important. I mean, I think that goes underrated. Everyone, it's so underrated about like raising capital. And the reality is we hear this over and over and over. And Jenny, we also have a question for you too, but in terms of giving out checks, there's no more just the check writing is slowed. It is a more curated process. It's a lengthier process, which goes to all the vesting times for these people, right? Both inside the company as well as the board members. So the question for you is that, have you passed on a company because they didn't have a board or didn't want to provide a seat for investors at seed stage, or did you see this happening more frequently before?
Yeah, so I really invest at, what's now called the pre-seed. Maybe that term didn't exist when Jody and I and Matt were starting, but these are very small rounds. They're done on safes, and there's never a board, and we don't take a board, and we don't necessarily, I'd say we've invested in 250 companies. Here's some data. 95% of them don't have a board and won't establish one in the round that I'm participating in. So the next round, which we'll call that, the seed round, which, is usually around a 3 to 5 million round. I'd say a board is always established, and we would expect that. That's a large amount of money. There's going to be a lead investor who's going to put in at least 1.5 million. And the expectation is that governance will become quite important at that moment. And I think, the question is really, how do we feel about that? And I actually feel good about it. I want my founders that are pre-product market fit to be spending their time building and selling. And rather than having 3 people, to guide them, we are putting, our trust in them. These companies, again, a lot of them are very, very early. And we feel that governance is important. And so sometimes, we have different stipulations. They need to send us updates. We need to have quarterly calls, information rights, etc. But we don't feel that a board is necessary for $1 million round at an idea stage company.
Yeah, a lot of formality. I'm going to segue into one last area for us, and I appreciate all the comments. They've been great, so please keep them coming. So as we wind up, we address what you'd like to hear. But there is obviously a lot of talk in the market right now, factually, on down rounds. And, the question came up around, when a company does a new share issue, are independents issued new shares, right? Do they get, if they've been diluted down, and what happens? So I'm going to show a couple of slides that'll just give us a point of reference. And so this is actually a deck. This wasn't even, I didn't have this for today, but I just went back to the deck that from last week, because I think this is dovetails nicely into this. So this is from our another survey, the option pool, change of year-end salary increase in option pool survey. So this is total percent of fully diluted ownership, all reported data. This just gives you a broad landscape, right? Founders, and the percentages here really are changed, the 25th, 50th, and 75th, depending on how many founders you have. Option pool, though, for the employees, somewhere in that about 15%. And then the board members, the 1, 2, the 4.4%, depending on how many you have. And the investors here, right? So here's on seed stage. I don't know, Jenny, if we agree on this, but I think pre-seed, somewhere in here, right under 5 million. It sounded like you were sort of saying maybe under 3 million.
Sorry, Jody, this is 75th. This is percentile of what?
This is the percentage of fully diluted shares. So this is the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile for a seed stage company on who's raised under $5 million in total financing. How is the cap table divided up? So this is founders. They have the bulk of it. The investors don't have as much. Option pool somewhere in that about 10 to 15% range. Outside board members too. Now we go to the next stage, early stage. In the world, according to J.Thelander, so the $5 to $15 million. So now you can see founders have gotten diluted down. The employee pool staying nice and healthy, somewhere in that 12 to 15%. So are the board members, but the investors are going up. So my point here is that once you get into this late stage, now the founders are really diluted down. The board members still pretty healthy at that 1 to 2%, depending on how many you have. The employee pool also very stable, around 15%, and the investors are going up. So there's 2 takeaways here. One is that the employee option pool has to stay robust enough, because you've got to plan for new hires, and that employee pool also includes reserve for future option plan, granted annually in refresh grants, and granted annually in new hire grants, and also included that is giving to outside board members. So really, the net of this is, to answer that question in a long way around, backed by some data, is the sooner that you get it right, using someone like Matt, guidance to hire, obviously you have an investor like Jenny who knows what they're doing, you only have to refresh so far if you got it right to begin with. If you didn't give somebody enough, you're going to have to give them more. If you gave somebody too much and they're getting diluted down, they may be where they should be. I mean, Jenny, what's your experience with this?
It's an interesting point about the down rounds. And I think maybe to Matt's point, if you have shorter vesting and shorter cycles of people in and out, then you avoid that to a certain extent, right? If there's a recap, a down round, you get a new board member in and you're able to kind of refresh or give new grants at a different strike price. So I think that could be an interesting way to solve it. If you have people that are serving for 10 years, then you have to kind of think about, what to do with them, right? Because they're not happy and you don't want unhappy board members. That's my number one takeaway. Grumpy board members are not healthy.
Yeah. So Matt, what are you seeing with the down rounds for people that you've placed, or as they're questioning as they're coming in to negotiate their compensation for boards?
Yeah, welcome to the world that we're living in at the moment. And it's actually someone posted a question in the chat about this as well. Like, do you ever give directors refresh grants? As when financings come along. What I've always done with this in my companies is I've sort of treated directors the way we've treated employees. So if you do a financing and everyone gets diluted by 10 or 15%, that's a normal event. Great. If you're doing a financing that's such that you have to reload your entire company because their prior option grant is not worth enough, then that is also true for board members. And so if you top everyone up by 42%, you top up the directors by 42%.
Yeah, I think you captured it perfectly. And that's why I shared the option pool information, is because if there is a down round and it's affected everybody, then you have to make sure there's enough in the option pool, and you do need to give additional grants. I mean, this comes up, and I think the reality is, which is a good way to wind up, is that you have to figure out, and you both touched on this perfectly, what is important at that time, right? I mean, Jenny, you were talking about in the beginning, there's certain priorities. You want product, you want revenue, and then and sales. Matt, you're saying you want someone, if the board member's helping with sales, and at some point that may shift, and you may have different priorities, and that is where you have to figure out who are you going to re-up, because there's not going to be enough to re-up everybody.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing I would add is, like, especially as the CEO or the founders of the company, a lot of this is in the negotiation that you will have with the new investor coming in. And so I'd encourage you as the leader to make sure you have these conversations with your investor early on, so that you are on the same page. Hey, like, we understand we're doing this financing. We also want to make sure that our employees and our board members are taken care of. So let's create a holistic package, because unfortunately what I've seen is the financing gets worked out, and then we think about, all of the other stakeholders after, and then everyone gets upset, and then it's, we have to figure out where the equity is coming from. So if you kind of think about going into your financing, like, okay, this is what my cap table looks like, and I have to figure out, how to take care of all our stakeholders, then I think you just set yourself up for a different conversation. So I would encourage that mentality.
Matt, any last thoughts on that?
The earlier you start those conversations, the better.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to wind up. We've used the word holistic in many references in this conversation. And it's very important. The more planning you do, obviously we have the expertise. Matt, you help build the teams. Jenny, you're just, awesome. You've got every angle of expertise. And of course, we've got the data, which you can use to make good decisions. The data is not the answer, but it certainly is a good guideline. We just added in the team I'm going to put in the 2-second pitch for the J.Thelander survey, because it's a give to get model. The data is real time. You get access to a subset of the results, and participation is really easy. So we'd love you to participate. Thank you so much, Bolster. Amazing job. You and your team, Matt, have been just a pleasure. Thank you, audience. Wonderful. And we will send out a recording of this. And if you have any separate questions for us, please feel free to reach out and let us know.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Joining
Everyone, thanks.
Yeah.